Since the introduction of the National Quality Framework, the topic of learning stories has been raised in almost every early education and care forum. This is probably because learning stories have the capacity to satisfy many of the new requirements of the National Quality Standard, the Early Years Learning Framework, and My Time, Our Place. However, many educators are still unsure about what learning stories look like, how to write them, where and how to display and file them, and how to use them to further children's learning and to involve parents in this learning. In this DVD, we answer these questions so that educators can feel confident that they know how to use learning stories to meet the requirements of the National Quality Standard. In particular, Quality Area 1, Educational Program and Practice, including the Early Years Learning Framework and My Time, Our Place, Quality Area 5, Relationships with Children, and Quality Area 6, Collaborative Partnerships with Families and Communities. Before we start, some brief background about us. Many of you know us already, but for those of you who don't, you can see we have worked in the early education and care sector for quite a few years now, and in a variety of roles. Together we form the ELF Made Easy team, and are the creators of the ELF Made Easy range of products. In this DVD, we outline the new requirements of the National Quality Standard for documenting children's learning. Next, we look at the way we have documented the program, specifically children's learning, in the past, and identify where this documentation falls short of meeting these new requirements. Then we will show 2 examples of learning stories before discussing the topic in detail. Finally, we will talk about how to display, file, and share them. The documentation requirements we must meet now are detailed in the National Quality Standard, the Early Years Learning Framework, My Time, Our Place, and the various state and territory kindergarten guidelines. So what are these new documentation requirements? Let's take a look at these requirements now. Standard 1.1. An approved learning framework informs the development of a curriculum that enhances each child's learning and development. Element 1.1.1. Curriculum decision-making contributes to each child's learning and development outcomes in relation to their identity, connection with community, well-being, confidence as learners, and effectiveness as communicators. Element 1.1.2. Each child's current knowledge, ideas, culture, abilities and interests are the foundations of the program. 1.1.4. The documentation about each child's program and progress is available to parents. 1.1.5. Every child is supported to participate in the program. 1.1.6. Each child's agency is promoted, enabling them to make choices and decisions and to influence events and their world. Standard 1.2. Educators and coordinators are focused, active and reflective in designing and delivering the program for each child. Element 1.2.1. Each child's learning and development is assessed as part of an ongoing cycle of planning, documenting and evaluation. 1.2.2. Educators respond to children's ideas and play and use intentional teaching to scaffold and extend each child's learning. 1.2.3. Critical reflection on children's learning and development, both as individuals and in groups, is regularly used to implement the program. Some of the documentation requirements are also throughout Quality Area 5, Relationships with Children, and Quality Area 6, Collaborative Partnerships with Families and Communities. Standard 5.1. Respectful and equitable relationships are developed and maintained with each child. Element 5.1.2. Every child is able to engage with educators in meaningful, open interactions that support the acquisition of skills for life and learning. 5.1.3. Each child is supported to feel secure, confident, and included. Standard 6.1. Respectful, supportive relationships with families are developed and maintained. Element 6.1.2. Families have opportunities to be involved in the service and contribute to service decisions. Standard 6.2. Families are supported in their parenting role and their values and beliefs about child rearing are respected. Element 6.2.1. The expertise of families is recognised and they share in decision making about their child's learning and well-being. If we are to meet these requirements, many of us will need to make some changes to our current ways of documentation. We may need to keep some, discard some, modify some, and add some. Pam will briefly reflect on ways we documented in the past, dispel some widespread myths, and talk more about learning stories.
We mentioned earlier that one of the reasons for the widespread interest in learning stories is that they meet many of the documentation requirements of the National Quality Standard, the Early Years Learning Framework, and My Time, Our Place. These form Quality Area 1 of the National Quality Standard. Our traditional programming methods do not necessarily meet these requirements. Let's take a moment to look at how programs used to be documented. Before the National Quality Framework was introduced, we used to observe a child, document that observation, interpret it, decide on an activity to extend the child's learning, implement the activity, and then evaluate how well that activity went. We did not share that information with the child and rarely shared it with the parent. As educators, we made all the decisions about the program, didn't we? The programming cycle, as it was called, was often presented in diagrammatic form and looked something like this. Observe, interpret, plan, action the plan, evaluate, and start the cycle all over again. I'm sure that most of you will recall these. We wrote our observations something like this. The only variation was whether it was a running record or an anecdotal record, that is, written in past or present tense. Take a look at this one here. Remember how these observations had to be objective? No opinions, just what we could see, hear, or feel, as in touch, as we observed the child. No drawing on our intuition or of our understanding of the child. We wrote purely what we could see, hear, or feel, and nothing more. If we only use observations like this with their emphasis on objectivity and almost exclusive use by the educator, not shared with the child and rarely with parents, we will not meet the requirements of the National Quality Standard, Early Years Learning Framework, and My Time, Our Place. We need another way. Learning stories are one method of documentation that you might like to use, because as you will see shortly, they document children's learning in a way that meets each of the requirements. In addition, an intuitively written learning story is something any parent would treasure. Before continuing, it's timely to dispel two myths about learning stories. The first is that the National Quality Standard requires educators to write learning stories. This is far from the truth. The National Quality Standard does not tell us how to document children's learning or the methods we are to use. The words learning story cannot be found anywhere in the National Quality Standard. The second myth that we need to dispel is that learning stories are the only methods we need to use to document children's learning. Some centres have done this. This is not true. We also need to continue to use a range of methods such as anecdotal records, jottings, captioned photographs, work samples, traditional observations, and perhaps checklists. So what is a learning story and when should we use one? A learning story records an event initiated by the child or children, and it records the child or children's response to that event or an educator's intentional provocation. Learning stories are always positive. Learning stories can vary in length and complexity. They can include one or more photographs, a few or many words, and be written about one child, two children, or even a group of children. However, learning stories must include specific elements. Here is a summary of those elements. Each learning story must have a title, a photograph or photographs. It will include text that begins with the educator's interest in the child's action. For example, it will be written in the first person, I saw, I watched. It describes the child or children's actions. It will include a section on what it means, and also a section on opportunities and possibilities. There will be links to the Centre philosophy and the Early Years Learning Framework outcomes. There will be a space for comment from families and from children. There will be a copy provided for the Centre and family. In this DVD, we have two learning stories to show you. In the first example, an educator noticed 4-year-old Trent standing in the sand, looking very thoughtful. A short time earlier, she had noticed Trent watching his feet as he scrunched his toes in the sand. The educator intuitively thought that this may well develop into something interesting, something worth observing, recording, and photographing. She was right, and the following delightful learning story was the result. This learning story is entitled Trent's Sandy Story. I watched as Trent bent down and scooped up sand with both hands. He squeezed his hands tightly and then relaxed his grip and watched the sand cascade down to the ground. He repeated this action a number of times. He then scooped up a single handful of sand, squeezed it, and slowly released the sand grains onto his other hand. Trent watched closely as the sand fell onto one hand and then onto the ground. Trent dropped onto his knees, extended both arms, and swept them through the sand. He repeated this action several times as he watched the grains of sand shift through his fingers. Trent curled his toes in the sand as he paused for a moment and considered his next move. Trent made the sand into a hill. He gathered some of the stones and shells from nearby and piled them beside him. Trent squatted onto his haunches and examined the sandhill he had created. He began to decorate the sandhill using the items he collected earlier and had piled nearby. He carefully repositioned some items before pressing them firmly into the sandhill. What it means. Trent, you watched closely as the sand moved through your fingers. First you held the sand tightly and watched it fall. Then you held it loosely to see what would happen. You were really thinking about the sand and how it feels and moves. You experimented. That's what scientists do. Today you were a scientist. You were also an artist because you carefully created patterns and designs using the shells and stones you found. Opportunities and possibilities. During sand play, Trent was curious, creative and imaginative. He was intrigued by the physical properties of sand. We can build on these dispositions and his interest by providing measuring spoons and cups, containers in a variety of sizes and shapes, funnels and sieves. We can also provide opportunities for him to explore his creativity further by introducing other natural items. Other children might have some ideas about what to try next. The parent's voice. Trent, you are wonderful. I've seen you look intently at objects in nature carefully before. Now you can see yourself doing it too. I really enjoyed sharing this story with Trent. He asked me to read it to him many times, and then he showed his father too. I would never have known that Trent could be this purposeful and creative if I had not seen this lovely learning story. Thank you for recording this special event and sharing it with us. Trent had a voice and he said, "The sand felt funny and I liked making the sand castle." As you may have already noted, this learning story has links to the Early Years Learning Framework. Indeed, learning outcomes 1.1, 2.1, 4.1 and 4.2. The second example of a learning story is called Michael's Moment and is about a younger child. Brenda will share this with you.
Thanks, Pam. This learning story consists of one photograph and 3 brief sentences. Often with younger children, we only have a small window of opportunity to observe them before their interest changes. It is about a little boy being transitioned from the babies to the toddler's room. Prior to Michael's move, the educators in the baby's room had shared information about him with his new educators. That information included how much he liked to play with cars. This learning story is about Michael's first day in the toddler's room. It was Michael's first day. I watched him as he hesitantly walked around the room. Then he saw the brightly coloured cars and smiled. He walked over to them, sat down and began to play with the cars. What it means. Michael, you looked uncertain when you first arrived. Then you found some cars to play with and felt a lot happier. Opportunities and possibilities. Next time we will make sure the cars are available and add people and roads. We will find some books and puzzles about cars to extend this interest. Parents' voice. We were relieved to hear that Michael settled once he found some familiar toys. It seems as if he will like his new room. Thank you for helping him settle into the room by providing items he enjoys. Dan. Child's voice. Not surprisingly written by his educator. Michael looked up and gave a small smile, which I took to mean he felt more settled. The links to the Early Years Learning Framework outcomes are 1.1, 1.2 and 3.2. As you can see, both examples include all of the elements of a well-structured learning story. But how can we ensure that we always include these elements in our learning stories? You may choose to use a format something like this one. Alternatively, you might like to vary the look of your learning stories and use the list of elements as a checklist. Now that we have seen the 2 examples about Trent and Michael, let's discuss each of the elements that make up a learning story. Like every good tale, a learning story needs a title. Trent's Sandy story and Michael's moment are examples. Choose a title that captures the essence of the experience, something catchy. Ask older children to choose the title for themselves, because after all, it is a story about them and their learning. This unusual title was chosen by the children involved. They created and performed a play, which they called the Stuffed Animals and Fragile People play. The title had meaning for the children and related to the story they wished to tell. A learning story needs at least 1 photograph. More if you like, but only include those that are relevant and large enough for detail to be seen, like this one. It needs text. Write in the first person, use I, and with the readers in mind, so that they feel that they were there too. This is where you would provide a little background on what led to the experience, or why you chose to document it, and when and where it occurred. Next, introduce the child or children involved. Describe what you saw them do and heard them say. Quote any comments you feel are significant. Include any pertinent decisions they made and the consequences, right from the heart. A learning story has a section on what it means. In this section, write as if you were speaking to the child about what happened. After all, you will read it to them later, as will their parents. Describe what happened. Say why you think the event is significant to the child and identify any learning dispositions that might be relevant to their learning. It also has a section for opportunities and possibilities. This is where you write about how you might encourage and extend the dispositions, interest, abilities, understandings and the play that you have observed. Ask parents and children for their ideas. The parent's voice should be included. Provide a space for parents to comment. They may write comments meant for the child or the educators. Initially, you might need to explain to parents that learning stories, including their comments, are written so that they can be read to the children. We also need to include the child's voice. Read the learning story to the child, ask older children to comment, and write their comments down. Educators working with younger children may interpret their response, as they do with their communications throughout the day. Include links to learning outcomes. Read through the Early Years Learning Framework or My Time, Our Place Learning Outcomes and write down those relevant to the experience. Now Pam is going to talk about one or two more points about learning stories.
For a moment, let's revisit the National Quality Standard requirements, and you will see that both these learning stories about Trent and Michael meet most, if not all, of these requirements. What are these requirements? They are that learning stories illustrate how parents' and children's ideas and points of view are valued, respected, and included. That the learning story means something to children, and children can share and enjoy them with other family members. That they provide parents with a true insight into their child's day at the service and the learning that occurs there. Learning stories are to make it easy for parents to contribute to their child's program. They increase children's understanding of the way they learn and what they have learnt, that is, reflexivity. They detail how educators respond to children's ideas and play, and how intentional teaching is used to scaffold and extend each child's learning. Learning stories demonstrate how educators reflect on children's learning and development. They enable educators to draw upon their professional expertise, humanness, and knowledge of individual children to provide quality programs. And learning stories also promote children's agency. These requirements relate to the National Quality Standard in quality areas 1.1.1, 1.1.2, 1.1.3, 1.1.4, 1.1.5, 1.1.6, 1.2.1, 1.2.2 and 1.2.3. One last point before we complete our discussion about learning stories. We have already seen what we write in a learning story is different from what we write in our objective observations. We can draw upon our professional knowledge, prior knowledge of the children or child, and our intuition and feelings. Learning stories are far more meaningful and align with the Early Years Learning Framework and My Time, Our Place requirements more closely if we include information about the child or children's dispositions. As you can see in this example from our Early Years Learning Framework terminology poster set, dispositions are our outlook on life and our approach to new challenges. We know children's emotional state and level of confidence can affect their ability to learn either positively or negatively, and so do their dispositions. Dispositions largely develop through interactions with others. So as educators, an important part of our role is to shape children's dispositions so that they build a positive approach to learning. This list of dispositions can be found in Early Years Learning Framework and My Time, Our Place Learning Outcome 4. It includes curiosity, cooperation, confidence, creativity, commitment, enthusiasm, persistence, imagination, and reflexivity. The list of dispositions may vary depending on the source. Let's examine 3 of these dispositions and ask ourselves how often we consider them when documenting children's experiences. Curiosity. We see children displaying curiosity, but do we think to include dispositions such as this in our learning stories? Cooperation. Similarly, we see cooperation happening around us every day, but again, we need to document this. Persistence is another of the dispositions often overlooked. Given the close connection between dispositions and learning outcomes, it is important to include a reference to dispositions in our documentation. After all, our goal is for children to develop into people who are ready, willing and able to engage with learning. and to become people who are socially just citizens of the world. It is important to document in the context of the Early Years Learning Framework and My Time, Our Place, with their emphasis on these goals. How many learning stories should we write each week? This is a question we are asked quite often. Educators do not need to write a set number of learning stories in any given length of time. They are able to judge for themselves how many they should write. Quality, not quantity, is what matters. The goal is to demonstrate that the program is based on individual children's knowledge, ideas, cultures, abilities and interests. Who should have access to learning stories? As you might expect, the answer is that all interested and relevant parties should have access to the learning story. What to do with completed learning stories? Educators file or display learning stories in many different ways. Some keep a scrapbook in each room where the educators paste learning stories for everyone to enjoy. Others display them on a wall and replace them regularly. Yet others file them in children's individual files or portfolios. You may choose to do a combination of these things. When the learning story involves more than one child, educators can often add them to the portfolios of each of the children involved. Sometimes they add them unchanged. On other occasions, they may edit the learning story to emphasise that particular child's involvement and learning. Include photographs that focus on that child. Add that child's comments. Modify the section on what it means and opportunities and possibilities, and select the Early Years Learning Framework or My Time, Our Place learning outcomes that apply just to that particular child. Earlier, we talked about documentation requirements that learning stories meet being threaded throughout most of the National Quality Standard quality areas, including Quality Area 5, Relationships with Children, and Quality Area 6, Collaborative Partnerships with Families and Communities. Learning stories can be used to assist us to have meaningful and extended conversations, not only with children, but with their families. For example, you could choose to personally share a learning story with a parent, enabling you to build on your relationship with that parent and developing a shared, comprehensive understanding of their child. You may also post or email a learning story to parents. Any parent would enjoy receiving such a communication. Services often display learning stories on notice boards or place them in shared folders where all families can access them. Others include them in their regular newsletter. This helps families to understand the value of learning stories and the insights they offer into their children's thinking and learning. Another effective way to develop understanding about learning stories and their value is to create or buy a set of posters and display them, such as those shown here from our range of posters. This poster lists the elements that make up a well-structured learning story. It is a helpful reminder for educators as they work. The second poster details the value of educators and parents sharing learning stories with children. Your learning stories may not have all of the required elements. If you choose to continue to use that format, you will have to meet the National Quality Standard requirements in some other way. While your current format enriches children's portfolios and families and children enjoy their relaxed style, it cannot be considered to meet the National Quality Standard requirements to the same degree as a well-structured learning story. Along similar lines, earlier we talked about our documentation prior to the National Quality Standard. We stressed that these earlier methods still have a part in our documentation, just not the central role that they had previously. It is important to have some objective observations to look back on, or for another educator to use as a reference, as well as those which include our thoughts, feelings and interpretations. To summarise, in this DVD we have detailed the National Quality Standard requirements for documenting children's learning, identified areas where our previous documentation fell short of meeting the requirements, looked at examples and used them to illustrate the elements of a learning story, discussed how many learning stories we need to write, possible ways to display and file them. Finally, we talked about how we can use learning stories to further children's learning and involve parents in that learning. It's easy, isn't it? Thank you from Pam and Brenda from the Elf Made Easy team.